Welcome to BrainTalk, a podcast from Project BrainStorm about the bipolar spectrum. Your hosts are Dr. Jim Phelps, a psychiatrist and author of several groundbreaking books about bipolar, and Sara Schley, author of the memoir Brainstorm, From Broken to Blessed on the Bipolar Spectrum, and co-creator of Brainstorm the Film, coming to you in 2025. Here on BrainTalk, we'll interview new experts each week about their research and expertise within bipolar, and listeners will call in to ask questions. Let's work together to save lives, end the stigma, and create healing for everyone on the bipolar spectrum and those who love them.
Hey, Jim.
Hello, Sarah.
How's it going out there in Portland? Is that where you live, Portland? No.
Well, nearby, hour and a half south thereof, in the middle of the Willamette Valley of Oregon.
Okay, well, sometime I'll get out there. I wanted to show you my mug.
That's your mug for today. This is my mug for
I
today.
actually made this thing.
Oh, did you really? Wow.
Yeah,
cool.
And I'm so proud of it because I do no artwork ever. But we do talk about in PECs, physical, emotional, creative, spiritual, preventative strategies, that creative piece. So I got my hands on some clay at a friend's house, her studio, and it was really, really pretty therapeutic. I liked it. I can't draw for the life of me, but...
I've discovered that some people, when they retire, they take up some kind of art form, sculpture, for example. Well, my form of sculpture that I've discovered I can just spend hours is making PowerPoint slide programs.
Oh, God, not mine. I thought you were going to say your form of sculpture is pickleball.
Well, I'm still playing a lot of that, but when it comes to being able to sit down and just do one thing and completely lose myself in it, it is silly, but it's really fun for me. And so that's what I'm doing when you're trying to be out there working on all of your different PECs angles.
You do you, my friend. But speaking of creativity, we have a really cool opportunity this morning to talk with Dr. Sheri Johnson from UC Berkeley. Are you familiar with Sheri's work, Jim?
Indeed, yeah. So she's done interesting work on creativity and ambition and the relationship between ambition and creativity. I found that fascinating. And then more recently, she's working on dietary changes and using food as a treatment would be a shorthand way of putting it. So really excited to talk with her about that as well.
Yeah, I'm interested in the relationship between the two. I found her work on creativity to be really another like stigma lifter, because we think of all the stuff associated with bipolar as, whatever, the stigma from Hollywood, irresponsibility, et cetera, et cetera. And she says, wow, you guys, me and my team, are disproportionately represented in all the creative endeavors. So I found that to be like, oh, look at us. It was helpful. I'm really interested to speak with her as well. One thing I wanted to say, though, is I understand there's a big rivalry between Cal and that other school to the south. Didn't you go to Stanford?
I did.
Isn't that like me talking from Boston, talking to somebody from the Yankees? Or are you willing to have a conversation with Sheri Johnson, even though she's from your enemy school?
It is fair to say that the University of California at Berkeley has produced some major advances in our science, and it's not just Stanford alone.
So, all right, you're a more evolved human being than I am. Well, that's great. So then without any further ado, we'll welcome Sheri Johnson to the show. Welcome, Dr. Sheri Johnson, to Brain Talk. So nice to see you today.
It's great to be here. Thanks so much, and good to see you.
Thank you for coming.
So, Dr. Johnson, is it okay if we refer to you as Sheri, or you?
Oh, please. Yes.
Okay, yes, that's good. All right. Well, I had the privilege of coming to know you through another one of our wonderful friends, Aaron Michalak from Crest, because of your work in creativity and bipolar disorder, or I like to say bipolar condition. But at any rate, would you just introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about your work in bipolar and what you're excited about that you're doing?
Of course. Yeah, thank you. So I'm Sheri Johnson. I'm a professor at the University of California, Berkeley, where I run the CalMania or CALM program. CALM is a program that's really dedicated to understanding bipolar disorder. We use a lot of different approaches, but all with the goal to kind of how do we understand more about who's going to have a relapse when, who's going to do really well in life, like become very creative, and how can we use anything we learn to turn around and create better treatments, and particularly psychological treatments are our focus, psychological, behavioral, lifestyle treatments.
And Dr. Johnson, I've been reading your work, Sheri, and so I know that in addition to psychological treatments, there's also using food and dietary changes as a treatment. So we're going to be talking about that too.
Terrific. Thank you, Jim.
I was telling Jim a little earlier that from my standpoint as a person who lives with bipolar, when I first learned about your work around creativity, it was a huge shame lifter, like a huge stigma lifter. Like because we internalize the stigma about everything that's wrong with us because of what the culture says and our own experiences. And then comes along Sheri Johnson, who says, well, look, you guys are disproportionately represented in all these creative fields. So can you tell us more about that? Because it's going to lift my mood today.
That's awesome.
Like many of our listeners.
Thank you so much. So, I'm not the first pioneer in this area. I really give credit to Kay Redfield Jamison. If you haven't read her Touched with Fire book, it's unbelievably beautiful. And she talks about a lot of famous artists, famous writers who had bipolar condition. And I've been really fascinated by why is that? Why do we see this kind of creative advantage, and how broadly does it emerge? What kinds of areas could we see it in?
It's interesting that you'd mentioned Kay Redfield Jamison, because I've been referring to her book, her memoir, for Bipolar 1, as the parallel to Sara Schley's book, her memoir on Bipolar 2. I really think of them as the two most important books in terms of presenting these different experiences of bipolar. One of the reasons why we're excited to talk to you, in addition to the creativity angle, is things that people can do without having to rely necessarily on medications or even physicians. And your work in dietary changes gives people another way to approach this whole experience. So that's exciting too.
Thanks, Jim. Yeah, so on the creativity front, I think when I joined the field, people were already putting it out there that there's something going on where people with bipolar condition and people in the families of folks with bipolar were showing more creativity. Simon Kayaga has published a study with more than 1 million people in the Swedish population, showing that people with bipolar disorder and their family members are more likely to be in creative occupations than the general population, like being paid for their creative endeavors. So my question is why, right? And Sara, you meet people like you meet people again and again and again who have bipolar disorder, and you realize there's an extra spark for a lot of people. And I've been really interested in kind of how do we capture that? And one of the things we created was a scale to capture people having really big life ambitions, wanting to conquer more in their life than other people, to be the folks who write a book, who create a podcast, who create a movie, who make a difference. And in our work, we can see that same kind of set a goal and move towards it seems to be part of what's driving the creative accomplishment.
I noticed that as a clinician, this phenomenon that you've been studying as a researcher.
Oh, that's good to hear. Yeah. And so I'm really fascinated by that. I'm fascinated by how we protect it. What are the good sides of it? What are the bad sides of it? How do you take that extra level of willingness to go after a goal and a dream and say, okay, there's something really special here, but also don't let it bite you. Don't let it keep you up all night, for example. And so, Sara, you've been really an advocate for this. Okay, yeah, I'm going to go after my dreams, but I'm also going to have incredible daily rituals about how to stay calm, how to take stock of where I am, how to meditate, how to kind of check in. And I think that's part of that balance of, if you're going to be a person who lives with that sense of fully immersed, going after something, then also retreating, finding the space.
Absolutely. It took me decades to get there. And I hope for any listeners who are younger than me, it doesn't take you decades, because you can begin to understand what's at risk if you don't do these disciplines. Do you have any idea why? Like, why is it that people live with bipolar? We know there's a genetic component. Why do we end up with this disproportionate creativity?
My theory, anyway, and there's parts of this theory that have support, is that it's baked into the genes, that it's part of what you get with the genes. I think of it as being a very small part of a system we call reward sensitivity. So being a little more reactive to the potential for even a small reward in life. We know that people with bipolar disorder are higher on that quality, and their family members are higher on that quality. And I think the family connection is really intriguing because it turns out that the family members of people with bipolar disorder are showing just as much creativity as the person who has it, which to me says, okay, it's not about going into a manic episode, it's about having those genes. Then it's easier to get immersed in kind of a big dream and a big goal that other people might look at and go, not enough there for me.
So Sheri, you're saying the ambition comes from the reward sensitivity. That's the way in which they're related?
That's what I think of. I think of it as being one piece of that reward sensitivity part of what's going on.
Now, it doesn't seem fair that my brother could have all that creativity stuff without the severe depressions, but It proves your point.
People who have bipolar will call me and say, I'm an author, and is it a good idea for me to kind of push my manias higher? And I'm always sort of like, oh my gosh, no, don't do that. Like, protect your brain, protect your lifestyle. And the good news is that family members who've never had one of these episodes are showing these positive outcomes. So it's not like you have to push the mania to have the good outcomes. You want to protect against the mania and trust that there's something there that's going to persist even if you get symptoms under control.
Sheri, I'm really interested to hear not only about what exactly you're doing with Mediterranean diet and timed eating in terms of using these as tools in bipolar, but how did you come to that? Where did that come from? Because it wasn't the original line of work you were in.
I had been doing some work with a good friend, Lance Craigsfield. We've been interested in what happens with day-night rhythms or circadian rhythms in bipolar. There's a lot of work that says that many times people with bipolar are a little too awake at night and a little too sluggish by day. And you can think about that as a kind of flattening of that day-night rhythm. We'd been looking at that in early adolescence in bipolar. We're really fascinated by how powerful some of those signals are. And Lance pointed me towards a group of people at Salk Institute who were using the timing of eating to try and strengthen day-night rhythms. And they'd been applying that outside of bipolar, but nobody was pulling it into the area of mood disorders. So we got really excited about, could we use this to help strengthen day-night rhythms? So how do we take a whole body approach in helping people with this? And to start, we're choosing 2 super healthy diets known to be terrific in the general population and saying, how do we add those to standard medication approaches in bipolar and see if they help people have more stability? Maybe we could create a freely available, easy to implement add-on to medical care for bipolar that would help people and their family members have more stability. We would be so happy if this works. And so we're so excited about it. We got funding from the Wellcome Trust to launch the largest study of healthy eating in bipolar that's ever been done. And that's what we're doing.
You mentioned 2 diets, and of course everybody's going to want to know what the 2 are.
Yes, tell us about healthy eating.
All right.
We start cooking dinner right now.
Oh, there you go. We'll have a cooking show next. There's two diets that we chose because they both have really compelling evidence from randomized controlled trials in the general population. One is the Mediterranean diet, and one is what they call time-restricted eating. So time-restricted eating is the idea that it's less about what you eat and more about when you eat. So you try and restrict to 10 hours a day of eating that's tailored to your schedule. We have people log for weeks before we choose their perfect schedule. And you might be thinking, wait, don't most people eat 10 hours a day? No, most of us eat from the time we get up to the time we go to sleep. It turns out that most of us are just, if we're awake, we're nibbling. So constrain that. And the key here is make sure you stop eating a couple hours before you go to sleep, because otherwise you're still digesting, and that influences the hormones that you need to have a beautiful, good night of sleep. And wait a little bit in the morning. Let your cortisol that's naturally coming up in the morning come on up, and then have your breakfast. The other part of this is predictability. You're giving your body really critical markers for, okay, it's 10 in the morning, it's 7 at night, these are my times. You're anchoring your body. And that helps your body's hormones and digestive processes kind of get a rhythm. And that rhythm turns out to be just as powerful in animals as light is for setting your body rhythms. You've clocks in every organ in your body, and those are not all set by this brain clock. You have body clocks that are very responsive to when you're eating. So you want your brain and your body to work together on their rhythms.
I'm going to hear a statistical sample of 1. And so I've been doing this, you say 10 hours of eating, I've been doing 14 hours of fasting, which turns out is the same.
Yes,
Right?
yes,
You do the math.
exactly.
And the way I came to this was actually a naturopath who says it's anti-inflammatory, and I knew inflammation's bad for the brain. So I just started doing this at the beginning of the pandemic. I feel good. I don't know why, but it just has helped. It's been helpful, and it's not hard to me because it finish eating at 7:30, have breakfast at 9:30. It's not so hard. I don't find it hard. And my body's just used to it now, and it's like it gets hungry at exactly 14 hours.
Yeah,
Not before.
your appetite is a predictive system, which I never appreciated until I started following this. I was always a person who would be hungry at the bad times, like I'm in the middle of a meeting and I'm starving. Now my body knows what to predict. So I'm so glad you had this success with it, though. And yeah.
Are you looking for people for your study, Sheri? In case listeners are interested, we can put the link in the notes.
We would love people to sign up. We're looking for people from around the world in English-speaking countries. They can do a screener on our website. They can send us an email. We're hoping to recruit hundreds of people and see how this works for various people. And for each person, we're going to ask a lot of questions to figure out what works for them, what doesn't, who does this work for, who can we roll it out and recommend it for in the future. We really want to get a good glimpse of this.
Good.
Awesome.
We'll put that website link in our show notes just to make sure. Can you say the website that you want people to go to?
calm.berkeley.edu.
Well, Sheri, we have a caller who's called in on the line with a question for you. We're really delighted to welcome Andrea on the line. And Andrea, you could go ahead and ask your question for Dr. Johnson now.
Sure. Hi, everybody. Thanks for doing this. This is really great, really interesting information for someone, just living with this condition. I've got 2 questions. You can take your pick. I'll ask them both. So I love this acknowledgement in the first part of your talk, Dr. Johnson, about people with bipolar sort of being a little more sparkly. I think sparkly is the word you use, something along those lines. I love that. That's very validating. Thank you. That really resonates with me. So I've experienced this intense sort of burning creativity. When I was younger, I'd stay up all night and write poetry and write philosophy. I think once I rededuced the theory of communism in the middle of the night. It's good stuff. When I started taking lithium specifically, it sort of felt like a bit of a wet blanket on that creativity. And things have been so bad for me that I was okay with that personally. But I hear a lot of my peers, they kind of don't want to take their meds because of this. What would you say to them? How can you guide people through that?
Yeah, thank you for raising this. I think it's a really personal decision, but I think what has to go in there is exactly what you're thinking about, which is what are the costs of a potential relapse? And it's easier, when you're well to think, okay, maybe I'll never have a relapse again, but the statistics are that that's a risk. And so I think you have to weigh that. And then the other thing I always encourage people to do is just keep working with their doctor on, is there a medication profile that's going to have fewer side effects? Is there a way to shift things that are sedating to the evening? Is there a way to consider a different medication, a different dose? And to work with the doctor on like, what is an outcome that's okay for you? What I want for everybody is a doctor who really listens to what they're trying to think of when they're striving for balance.
Aren't we lucky that we have one on the show?
Yes, Jim is known internationally for being sensitive like this.
Been a
Yeah.
clinic clinician for many years with people living with this condition like us, Andrea. Jim, how would you respond to Andrew's question?
Well, a couple things. And first, thanks for the question. It's on many people's minds. First is lithium in particular has this effect of being blunting and flattening in about 1 person in 10, I would say, in my experience. So that means 9 people out of 10 don't get that effect at all. And for me, that was something to listen for. If someone starts to describe that, gee, too bad, you're that 1 person in 10. We need to look at other tools like Dr. Johnson was just describing. Then there's this worry, though, that by not being like fully manic or really hypomanic, I won't be as creative, I won't be as accomplished, I won't get this and that done. I say, well, that might be, I'm not sure, but let's look not just at the hypomanic or manic phase, but at the depressed phase that either preceded or commonly follows it. And if we look at that as a whole, how did you do in terms of your productivity and accomplishments when you look at that whole period of time? And my prediction for you would be, if we can get rid of the depression, your net productivity and accomplishment will be higher even without hypomania or mania, because it's the depressions that are really going to hammer that. So we think of it as treating the whole of this process, not just taking away something. We're actually giving you greater productivity and accomplishment is my prediction. Let's try and see if that's really actually how it turns out for you.
Yeah, wow, it sounds like you would both be great treatment providers, because I know for me it was that grief and that preference wasn't really acknowledged, and it was sort of like, well, you're stable now, that's good, we're on our way. So that's really validating to hear. Thank you for that.
Sheri, wasn't there also something in your work about people have their perception of their productivity when manic versus not is actually not accurate? Like, can you say something about that?
Yeah, so probably the most cited example of this is Schumann. We know a lot about Schumann and his mania and depression because he kept going through the hospital, and he wrote about his moods.
Composer Robert Schumann.
Yeah, thank
Robert
you.
Schumann. Yeah, I can't remember first name.
Yeah.
Have I got it right?
Yeah, I think you're right. He produced more pieces when he was manic and hypomanic than when he wasn't. But if you look at what recordings are re-released over time and played on the radio and albums sold, they're not the ones he produced when he was hypomanic or manic. So same thing with authors. You can get a lot of words on the page, but are they the words you're going to treasure 10 years later? Or are you going to treasure the words that you produced in a period where you had a little more calm, a little more serenity?
And looking at a graph of Schumann's compositions, there would be a burst, and then there would be this blank period. And the blank periods, as I recall them, went on longer than the bursts did. So not only was quality different, but quantity, if you look at that whole period of time, really suffered because of those depressed phases.
Thank you guys for that. That's true. You know, like I said, I wrote a lot of poetry, and some of it was good, and a lot of it was not. So, you know, that's fair. My other question is about this time restricted eating. What can people do if they're like me and they struggle with maybe low blood sugar, other neurological problems that make fasting very difficult? Are there principles that someone like me can integrate that still might be helpful?
Yeah, without a doubt, there's medical conditions that would, suggest that you shouldn't follow this. So it's always a good idea to check with your doctor. In terms of like low blood sugar, one of the things, I've always struggled with that. I've always had a hard time with that. And one of the things is that the first 2 or 3 days of restricting your food, you're going to have some periods where you're kind of more hungry in the morning. You're going to be a little more like have that low blood sugar kind of thing. but your body adapts super quickly. So even within the first couple days of following the plan, your body begins to have better blood sugar kind of rhythms. And they can see that with continuous glucose monitors. So what we do is we say, okay, don't make it too extreme, like go from 14 hours to 12 hours first. If you're worried, you can go from 14 to 13, follow that for a week, then go 13 to 12. And plan those transition days for a day where it would be kind of okay to feel a little bit of that low blood sugar, irritable kind of feeling for a couple hours in the morning.
Right.
And think about what you'll do that's really nurturant to yourself for that kind of early wake up period. Like what's a good ritual as you're getting through that kind of first couple mornings of like you may be a little hungry.
That's really interesting. So maybe like an upfront investment for a long-term benefit.
Yeah, like a lot of people will say like, you know what, I'm going to put in an extra meditation session. I'm going to give myself a really nice cup of tea. I'm going to do something on that morning that's really soothing for me.
So Sheri, that's what I do every morning, how I think the 14 hours that I wait doesn't bug me. And it works with all the other good stuff that we try to do, because I always do like yoga and exercise first thing in the morning. Got to get that out of the way. So that way I've done my physical part, and then boom, all of a sudden the 14 hours are done. So it's a win-win.
Yeah. But I do think there is something where for a lot of us, breakfast is this little way that we sort of wake up and take care of ourselves. And I know when I first started shifting it later, I found I really missed that ritual. Like I had to rethink, well, what is my little morning ritual of kind of take care of myself, gently wake up, because it wasn't okay to just wake up and say, oh, great, I'm not eating breakfast, I'll go to work. I had this wall of kind of, are you kidding me? I'm not ready for work. So you kind of construct a ritual or a kind of a way of being good to yourself in that space.
And that ritual can be knit together with the rise time and regular bedtime, regular rise time, so that there's just a standard way of doing things. So I like the sound of that very much.
That's the hope. That's the hope.
Cool. Well, anything else, Andrea, before we bid you farewell?
No, that's it. Thank you guys so much. I really appreciate this.
Andrea, your questions are great. I really want to thank you.
You're welcome.
Yeah, thank you so much for coming on the show, Andrea. Take good care. Well, those are wonderful questions from Andrea that I'm sure a lot of people have out there.
And Dr. Johnson, I was just particularly impressed with the way in which you answer this. Really reflects all the experience of talking with people many, many, many times to really understand these are the challenges that people go through. I appreciate that. I'm sure our listeners will be able to recognize that as well.
Thank you so much.
So I'm sure everyone's wondering, when will we have results? On the edge of our seats.
I'm on the edge of my seat. I want to know. It's going to take us 5 years to do this study. We're 6 months in, and we want to work with hundreds of people, and we want to follow not just how it works for them for 8 weeks on the diet, or the food plan, but then even a year out, what do they say? How many of them are still following it? How many of them find that they have benefits long term? So we got some months ahead of us to figure this out.
I take it that you have funding or hope to have funding for that whole period of time.
We are so thankful. Wellcome Trust gave us funding to pull this off in the way we wanted
great.
to. Yeah.
Really nice.
Amazing. Well, Dr. Johnson, thank you so much for your brilliant work, which I really appreciate as a person living with bipolar, and excited to hear what comes out of your study. And yeah, just thank you for coming on the show and for who you are.
Thank you both for all you're doing for our community, for the world. It's really an honor to be on your show.
Thank you for being here. And our listeners, don't forget, you can go to the CALM program, CALM, at calm.berkeley.edu. Did I get that right?
No idea.
Pretty impressive. It'll be in the show notes. Yeah.
Calm.berkeley.edu, and no one knows how to spell Berkeley. It's BERKELY.edu.
And sign up. Good.
All right. Take good care, everybody. We'll
Yeah,
see you soon.
take care.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, Sheri.
Well, what'd you think, Jim?
Oh, very interesting. It just makes the whole thing so accessible, so within reach. and not something that requires special attention, just being deliberate about when you choose to eat and having a plan around that. And what I particularly like is the low risk that goes with them, so that people can try this, and maybe it works, maybe it doesn't, but there's I think of it as a low barrier to trying it because the risk side is so low.
I love that. And the other positive thing for me is that it's low risk, high agency. In other words, it gives me something to do that makes me feel like I have control over this thing, rather than I'm just at the whim of destiny because of my genetics. I can actually take measures that will make a difference, and I find over time that they have. We do have more guests coming, and I look forward to our next show.
Good.
Take good care. Okay.
You too.
Bye, Jim.
Bye, Sarah.
Go play pickleball.
Right on.
Thanks so much for joining us on BrainTalk, our bipolar spectrum podcast. BrainTalk is a program of BrainStorm, a multi-platform project about the bipolar spectrum, which includes Sara Schley's memoir and a full-length documentary coming in 2025. We aim to save lives, crush stigma, and maximize healing for all people living with bipolar and those who love them. For more information, head to www.brainstormthefilm.com. To call in to a future episode and ask questions, go to brainstormthefilm.com/podcasts.